Kesara, and today, in honor of Women's History Month, I'm going to be recommending you books about women. Specifically, most of these are going to be historical fiction or actually non-fiction books about women, but I will have some other books thrown in there, but I will not have any sci-fi or fantasy books on this list. I am going to be doing a separate video on this, which I will upload soon, with the sci-fi and fantasy books that would have made it onto this list. But part of the reason I wanted to do this list is because I absolutely love seeing the portrayal of women in fiction or in nonfiction and kind of the struggles that women go through, especially when it comes to historical fiction, like what this video is mostly about. Honestly, these are books that I just don't get to talk enough about on my channel, so I wanted to recommend you guys some books. So I'm starting this video out with nonfiction books about women that I absolutely think everyone should read because they are all fantastic. This first one is actually women's history, and that's Radium Girls by Kate Moore. I absolutely love this book, partially because of just how well it's written. It definitely tells a story about these women, and there's multiple different women that it follows throughout the entire length of the book, but it's also just the gruesome horror that you feel when you're reading this book that you don't even realize until like it creeps up on you. This book is telling the story of women who worked in the watch industry. I believe it was the 1940s. I don't remember the exact time period. During the time period that it's set in, radium is an element that was discovered by the Curies. Marie Curie actually died from radiation poisoning, but at the time the public didn't fully realize that radium was dangerous, even though the scientists did. But the commercial industry was really pushing a lot of products that had radium in it. Specifically in this book was the watch faces, and these women worked in these factories that created these watches, and they would have to paint the watch face with radium so that it glows in the dark. And one of the things that I found the truly horrifying about it was they were actually told to lick the paintbrushes that they were using for better production because it was faster than dipping it in water. Things like that just like hurt you because you know, like now we know, obviously the entire public will know that radium is radioactive and you should definitely not be licking radioactive substances. And back then it's not like they didn't know that. That knowledge just wasn't widespread. So these women were taken advantage of because of that, and it had lasting consequences to their lives because obviously they're gonna get some sort of radiation sickness from that. It is definitely a harrowing and at times gruesome tale of the story of these women's lives, but it's really well done and a really great book about women's history that I really enjoyed. So we definitely recommend Radium Girls to anyone who wants to know more about women's history. The other two books in this list that I wanted to talk about are both memoirs written by women, and I'm not going to do like the super popular ones, but just ones that I read because I've read actually quite a lot of memoirs written by women, but these are ones that have stuck with me through the years. And the first one is My Story by Elizabeth Smart. So Elizabeth Smart was a girl who grew up in Mormon society, but at a very young age she was kidnapped by a radical religious leader. I don't remember exactly what it is. I don't think he was a Mormon, but basically he kept her in a basement and raped her multiple times, and she wasn't the only girl that he did this to. So it is a difficult story to read, and it's told by the person that this actually happened to. So I feel like first account tales like this are important to read just to understand what actually happens to people sometimes. While this is difficult to read, it definitely gets your mind thinking and understanding the mindset of how a lot of women may be scared about situations that could happen that are like this. Obviously, the story does have a happy ending because the little girl was found and she grew up and was able to write this memoir, but there are many tales like this. The girls are not found. So I felt like this was an important one to include as well. And then the last one is on kind of a completely different note, not quite as harrowing as these, and I always feel like it's important to have some humor as well, and that's why I'm including on this list The Girl with the Lower Back Tattoo by Amy Schumer. Now, Amy Schumer is obviously a female comedian, which she is very popular. Personally, I never really followed her work until I read this book. There are a ton of comedian memoirs out there, and I've read quite a lot of them. Listening to the audiobooks of these memoirs are the best way to do it because the comedians do the audiobooks themselves, and obviously they're stand-up comedians. kids, so they know how to talk. So it comes out really, really well done. And this one is no exception. This is the one that stuck with me the most because I felt like I really got to know Amy Schumer and her thought process behind like what she does and like things that she says and things like that. And I absolutely love it. Especially like the way she talks about her body and how the press a lot of times says, oh, she's brave for like not wearing as much clothes on stage and things like that. When, I mean, she's a size 6, so she's actually not plus size. She's actually quite a bit smaller than we would expect from the headlines that you hear about her. So it was interesting to see that perspective and just like seeing her background and everything like that. For some reason, this one has definitely stayed with me throughout the years, even though I don't even watch her comedy that much, but this one was definitely a great one that I think everyone should read as well. I highly recommend the audiobook for this one. So before we get into the fiction books that I'm gonna have on this list, I wanted to quickly include this poetry collection, Milk and Honey by Ruby Kaur, into this as well. This is obviously a collection of poems that really spoke to me in a way that I wasn't expecting. I had originally borrowed the ebook from this from my library and like almost immediately decided to get the physical copy just because there are illustrations throughout that you don't really get in the ebook. I think the very first illustration, I'm not gonna put it up here just because it's not probably YouTube friendly, kind of shocked me, but at the same time, it went really well with the content of the poetry. And this collection just surprised me in ways that I wasn't expecting. And it's definitely feminist in a lot of different aspects, and I really enjoyed it. So the first fiction book that I'm going to be talking about is actually the only contemporary novel that I have on this list. The rest of them are basically historical fiction, but the first one that I have is actually a contemporary romance, and that's It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. So Colleen Hoover is not typically an author that I would read for the portrayal of women that she has in her books. A lot of times they can be problematic, but I actually really liked this one in particular. And the reason for that is because I feel like I learned something that I would have never really thought about learning by reading this book. In this book, I got a much better understanding of the mindset of a domestic abuse victim and why they might choose to stay in that type of relationship, which I think is incredibly moving that a book like this can give me that sort of understanding, because this is 100% a contemporary romance novel. It is written like a romance novel, and although it doesn't have all of the characteristics of your typical romance novel, definitely has that vibe, and I would definitely recommend going into this book thinking of it like a romance novel. It's not entirely a romance novel in the best way possible. By far my favorite book by Colleen Hoover. It's the first one that I read by her, and it's part of the reason why I probably still like her as an author as opposed to some of her other books that I didn't like as much. But any book that can teach you the mindset of someone that you would normally not understand at all and not even necessarily care to understand, I think is definitely worth the read. The next book that I'd like to talk about is somewhat contemporary as well, and that is A Woman Is No Man by Itaf Rum. So this is following 3 generations of Palestinian American women, and they're first set in Palestine in 1990 and later on with the younger generation in Brooklyn in 2008. It definitely is very interesting to see the grandmother, the mother, and the daughter and how their different generations had different expectations placed on them and are raised in different ways. It's incredibly interesting, and I just loved every second of this. It is a pretty short book as well to read, and I just enjoyed it. And I think what got me the most was the ending, because it's told in like an incongruous timeline. So you see some events that happen later on in the story, but you see them earlier. So the ending of this is actually from an earlier period. It is so poignant because you know what's gonna happen later on, and it's not necessarily a good thing, but you know this character has to do what they're gonna do. I really love this book because of that. I wouldn't say it's like one of my favorites of all time or anything like that, but this book still has a special place in my heart. So the next book that I want to talk about is The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. Kristen Hanna is one of my favorite authors of all time. I absolutely love every single book that I've read by her, and this is actually the first book that I read by her. This is a World War II historical fiction, and it's probably my second favorite book by her, but the reason why I absolutely love this is because it's following 2 sisters that take very diverging paths during World War II. It follows their storylines and struggles that they had, kind of how they get past that. So it's very interesting to see the paths both of these women take during this very tumultuous era of human history. Also, I really love the sibling relationships that's in this book, because the sister relationship is really well done in a very realistic way, where it's a very complex relationship because obviously the sisters don't see eye to eye, which is why they do end up taking such different paths. And it's just a very well written historical fiction. Now, I don't read World War II historical fiction that much anymore, but this is definitely one of my favorites from when I was really into them. The next book I'd like to talk about is Before We Were Yours by Lisa Wingate. This is actually also historical fiction. This one is set in the United States though, and it's following two different generations. One that is a current generation and then a past generation, where it's following a young girl who lives with her siblings on this boat, but they're taken in by the government and sent to the Tennessee Children's Home Society. That orphanage did a lot of terrible things to children at the time, and the girl in that story is trying to keep her family together. So it's following her story through all of her struggles, and then later on it's following, I believe it's her granddaughter in the present day and some of the struggles that she's going through. It's a very well structured book that I enjoyed quite a lot, and I liked getting that real world history that you normally wouldn't think about or even learn about in school, but you still see the struggles that people went through in even just recent history. So I really like that aspect of this one as well. And the last historical fiction that I wanted to talk about on this list is one that's very popular, especially here on BookTube, and that's The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Now, I don't love all of Taylor Jenkins Reid's books, but this is one that I do absolutely love. I enjoyed this so much. This is following the fictional Hollywood icon Evelyn Hugo, and basically her entire life, including all 7 of her husbands and kind of how she ends up with those husbands, as well as her life through Hollywood. It's incredibly interesting to see how Hollywood actresses are treated during this time period, and also how she's treated by her husbands during this time period as well. I really enjoyed this. It's a very entertaining book, while at the same time having really interesting historical context that I think works really well. I would definitely recommend this book for anyone who likes historical fiction or just these types of books in general. So that is all I have for you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed watching. I post videos on Tuesdays and Saturdays, so consider subscribing. And I occasionally post bonus videos, so if you'd like to be notified as soon as I upload, you should click that little bell icon. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up to support my channel. All social media links are in the description down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.